To put it the way one of my producers put it, investigating the investigators, that's what's happening with the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, that's accused of fuzzy research for its claim Himalayan glaciers are like snow cones in Death Valley. Now the UN wants another panel to check up on the checker-uppers. Pat Michaels is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Mr. Michaels, thank you for joining us. Panel here, panel there. I mean, your thoughts?
Cedric, there's no such thing as an independent panel when it comes to the United Nations. This Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the senior authors that write these reports that are under investigation, are appointed by their governments. This has politics laced throughout it. And anybody who has enough expertise to be claimed to be a qualified evaluator of this panel is going to have to be a person who does tons of research on climate change, so they're going to have a vested interest in this being a problem. There's no way it's going to be independent, and it's going to be severely criticized.
So what's the point of all this then? If we go ahead and go down the logic that you've laid out here so far, what's the point of all this?
The point is a desperate attempt to herd cows back into the barn, the cows that got out when it turned out that there was blatant politicization of science with regard to the Himalayan glaciers and crop yield losses in Africa and sea level rise in the Netherlands, and the list goes on and on and on. They need to put a happy face on this and drive these cows back into the barn.
So are you saying that, and maybe I'm being presumptuous in asking you this, but are you saying that a lot of the stuff, a lot of the research that's been conducted by the IPCC, a lot of it is bunk, and that we shouldn't abide by those things?
The IPCC doesn't do research. It says it doesn't do research. It picks and chooses amongst the scientific literature, and it turns out literature from environmental organizations that wasn't exactly scientific, in order to create the reports that it wants to create. And it is very clear that the current leadership, Rajendra Pachauri, has a clear political agenda. When the Indian scientists said, wait, the glaciers aren't going to melt that fast, it's going to take them hundreds of years, what was the first thing he said? Voodoo science. They wanted that alarmist note to sound, and that's why this investigation is going to be very suspicious.
Okay, so that kind of leads me to this question, which is, if the IPCC has an agenda and trying to say what maybe the UN wants them to say...
You think.
Well, at least yes, exactly, at least as far as we think. What are we supposed to make of this whole notion of man-made or human-induced climate change?
The question is, why do we need the IPCC? When it was started, back in the 1980s, its charter was to provide the scientific background for a possible treaty on climate change. In other words, to provide the background for a treaty on climate change. They got their treaty. We don't need this. We have the internet now. We don't need government-appointed scientists to tell us what to think.
What is the message the UN is trying to spread out there about climate change through the IPCC and now this new panel that's going to be commissioned by the UN?
Well, the message is that climate change is a horrible problem, and the formerly rich world, i.e. the United States, should bankrupt itself further in supporting the currently poor world.
Okay. But does this necessarily give more credence to people who really question the notion of man-made or human-induced climate change?
Well, I think very few people question the notion that humans have had some influence on the climate. But where people question is this end of the world notion, this, all the Himalayan glaciers are going to melt by 2035. That's where the UN overstepped. And the UN writes its reports in ways that can always be read in very disastrous tones. So they know what they're doing. And right now they're very upset that they didn't get what they wanted in Copenhagen at the UN Climate Conference. They're very upset the United States is probably not going to go along with cap and trade. And this is just yet another attempt to try and impose legitimacy on this panel to try and order people around. Nothing new here.
Okay, Mr. Michaels, Pat Michaels from the Cato Institute here to shed some light on this new panel, to check up on the panel. Anyway, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Bye.